Okay, a very good morning to everyone again. For those of you who've just joined, we usually start our workshops and webinars a lot earlier, but today we're doing a different time slot. So thank you for availing yourself for this morning session. I know there's quite a few programs happening this morning, and with Women's Month coming up. Yeah, there's just a lot happening. So we appreciate the time that you're giving towards this very, very important and very unexplored issue that we face. We know for those of us working in the gender-based violence space, we know that working with law enforcement is not always easy. We do have some fortunate spaces where we have good relationships with our SAPs, with law enforcement, but we also know that violence within the police forces is not something that we are strangers to. The very people that we depend on to protect our vulnerable um, also are perpetrators. So this morning we're going to be looking at police-perpetrated domestic violence, understanding it a little bit better, but also understanding how it's addressed and how it's investigated. And those are important things that, I'm hoping we're going to leave this morning with a lot more insight into. And our presenter this morning is someone that the National Shelter Movement of South Africa has a long-term relationship with on various levels. Miss Claudia Lopes, who has supported the NSM for many years now through the Heinrich Boell Foundation. But I'm going to give you a formal intro this morning, and then I'm going to hand over to Claudia. So Claudia Lopes is a women's rights activist with over 20 years of experience in the gender-based violence, or particularly violence against women, spanning direct victim support in South Africa and the UK to advocacy work with the Heinrich Boell Foundation in Cape Town since 2011. She currently serves as Human Rights and Gender Justice Program Manager, leading research and advocacy to strengthen the state's response to gender-based violence and femicide, while also partnering with organizations, including the NSM, leading critical work in the gender-based violence and LGBTQIA plus rights sectors. She holds a master's degree in criminology and law from the University of Cape Town, and we're fortunate enough, Claudia, to have you this morning to present on this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, but I also just want to quickly check. So I'm going to be monitoring raised hands or anyone wanting to ask questions. Because it's a relatively short session, I'm not sure, do you want to do questions and answers at the end? Or are you open to taking questions as we go along?
It's actually, well, you say it's a relatively short, but I've got a whole hour of talking. So we've set 30 minutes aside towards the end of the session so people can hold on to their questions and answers. I mean, their questions and
Questions.
responses, that would be great at the end, please. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much, Claudia, for taking the time this morning. And I'm going to hand over to you. So, everybody, I know that you're in capable hands, and I know we're going to come out of this enriched with lots of information.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Anissa. Yeah, I'm just looking. There's 102 participants online, and I'm really rather surprised by that, but pleasantly surprised, but also adds to the nerves. But thank you so many to colleagues, friends, and people from the sector that are interested in this topic and joining us. I'm just going to share my screen. And I hope you also forgive me. I'm going to switch off my camera if I can do that because it's very disconcerting looking at yourself and presenting. All right, so thank you very much for inviting me, Zubaida and Anissa, to present on this research that I undertook for my master's in criminology and law. So I completed this last year after 3 long years of having no life whatsoever, in doing coursework and then writing this dissertation. And I know many people who've done masters, will know that there are moments where you question your sanity in having done so. But I can honestly say it was absolutely worth every late night, every rewrite, and every moment of doubt, because it gave me an opportunity to explore an issue that's very close to my heart, domestic violence, intimate partner violence more specifically, but also that is deeply relevant to South Africa. And one also that has emerged as a persistent problem in other police services around the world. So we all know that domestic violence is a significant issue in South Africa. It continues to devastate families and communities, with women being killed every day by the very men who should love, protect, and respect them. Now, police officers obviously occupy a very important role within this reality of domestic violence. As the primary protectors and defenders of safety and security, they carry tremendous authority and responsibility in responding to domestic violence. But yet, as you've heard from Anissa's, and as you'll hear from me, police are often far from being model defenders of law and order. They are very, very capable of themselves committing heinous acts of violence and also of failing to hold each other accountable when they do so. So now I'm going to talk to you about my dissertation, and I'm just going to show you, sorry, why is this not moving? There we go. I'm just going to explain our time together. I'm going to start by giving you a case study, which will set the scene of what we're about to discuss. Then I'll look at the study in essence, what I aimed to do and how I did that. Then I'm going to look a little bit more broadly in terms of what's happening globally around the world in terms of this topic, and then South Africa's response to police-perpetrated domestic violence. And then I'm going to provide you with some statistics, some data on femicide and also domestic violence cases. And then we'll delve into some of the reasons why does police-perpetrated domestic violence happen, how do the police investigate and address it, and some of the issues that create barriers to accountability. And then we're going to have I'll share some of my own recommendations and final reflections before I hand over to, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think, if you have any questions, etc. So you're going to hear my voice for a very long time today, so bear with me. So I want to start with setting the scene. So it's a case of a police officer called Richard Smith. This case in particular for me captures both the devastating consequences of police-perpetrated domestic violence and the failures of the system designed to prevent it. So yes?
Sorry, can I just interrupt you? So the
Sure.
sound is not so clear. I'm not sure if everybody else is getting that, but I know Debbie's also mentioned that she's getting an echo. So I don't know if it's
I'm not sure. I'm trying
but
to
can I
talk.
just check? Can I just check with everybody? Is it at least audible? So are you at least able to hear Claudia without missing any important information? Okay, so we are getting people saying that it's okay on their side, that they can hear. So
Yeah,
you
audible.
sorry about that. Okay, so I was just checking. So sorry, Claudia, you can go ahead if
Okay.
everybody's okay with the sound.
Okay, so I'm going to speak closer to my laptop, and I've opened the door, so hopefully there's no echo in this little room of mine. Okay, so I'm going to talk again about Richard Smith, which I think is a case that really exemplifies the tragedy of police-perpetrated domestic violence, but also some of the failures of the system. So in January 2022, Richard Smith was driving in the city, well, it's Piketberg. It's a small town in the Western Cape. He was heavily intoxicated. He was driving. He had a female companion with him in the car, and it was during the daylight. So he was driving down the street and he sees his ex-girlfriend, Natasha Boyce, and she's in town for shopping, as one does on a Saturday. And she had her aunt with her, she had her son with her, and other kids that were with them. So when he sees her, he stops the car and he calls her over to the car. So they have a bit of an altercation because he wants her to go with him, but she refuses, and they have a little bit of an argument. She turns her back to him, and he pulls out a gun and he shoots 7 times in her direction. So 3 of those bullets actually hit Natasha, and she dies. So he then follows Roslyn, which is the aunt, who then runs to a nearby to a petrol station with the kids in tow. And he goes over to her and pulls the gun on her too. And he says to her, "I'm going to shoot you dead." In fact, he said it in Afrikaans. He actually said, "Ek sal jou vrek skiet." But luckily, there were many witnesses at this stage, so he got back in his car and drove away. But he was arrested, which is obviously, this being happening in broad daylight. Now, as horrific as this incident was, it wasn't the start and end of his violence. He had a long, long history of violence and abuse prior to that. And I'm going to talk you through some of the violence that this guy was committing and that the system was aware of, but yet his reign of terror in general continued. So in 2013, Richard had an altercation with his father and he threatened to shoot him. So his father applied for a protection order, but he then later withdrew it. In 2014, he again had an altercation with his father, and this time he actually shot at him. But the charges were mediated and the case was withdrawn. His violence continued. In 2015, he was arrested for stabbing a man and convicted of assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. He was sentenced to 36 months in correctional supervision, 24-hour arrest, and 16 hours of community service. And it was at this point that his firearm was withdrawn, which obviously is a good thing. But it didn't end there. In 2017, he was back in court for common assault. He was at the bar, he beat up a man, he was arrested and back in court. Then in 2018, again back in court a year later for traffic violations and resisting arrest. He was fined just 3,000 Rand. And then in 2020, police gave him his gun back. So I'll explain what is this time period of 2015 to 2020. So here in 2020, he gets his firearm back, and only 2 years later, he shoots dead his girlfriend. So that's the case of Richard Smith, which I crossed out the X in that little graphic that I've included because the newspaper there said he was an ex-cop, and he wasn't an ex-cop. He resigned 1 day before his disciplinary hearing after he was arrested for Natasha's death. So through all this time, he was an active member of SAPS. Now, we could say this is a once-off case, but we know many of us in the sector that have been doing this work, and people that read newspapers know he's not the only case, right? And I'm going to show you some of the figures that was also happening in 2022. So, Richard Smith was only one of 208 Western Cape officers reported for domestic violence in that same year, of 417 nationally. He was also only one of 26 officers who was guilty of killing someone as a result of domestic violence nationally. So then he represents far more than the action of one individual. But his case shows us that the warning signs often do exist, that they are recorded, that they are monitored, that they are known by cops, that they are known by courts, and that policies and procedures do exist. So firearms are withdrawn, for example, but yet time and again, the system fails to effectively intervene before the violence escalates. So I thought this was a very good example of one case that happens in our police-perpetrated domestic violence. So I'm just going to talk to you briefly, like any research study does academically. You have to define what you are talking about, and you have to tell people how you actually did the research and what you aim to do. So for the purposes of my dissertation, police-perpetrated domestic violence is any form of domestic violence perpetrated by a police officer against an intimate partner, like a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or a family member. And like domestic violence, as many of us in the sector know, domestic violence includes physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, and economic abuse, as well as harassment, intimidation, and coercive and controlling behavior. So the question I had was, how is police perpetration of domestic violence understood, addressed, and investigated in South Africa? So at the heart of this, my objective was to understand not only how SAPS responds to police perpetrated domestic violence, but I also wanted to know why it continues to occur, because you'll hear soon that there are frameworks, there are policies, but it still continues nonetheless. So what I did was I wanted to build this national picture. I wanted to paint a picture of what the situation is. I wanted to focus on the Western Cape, not only because, it was convenient because I'm from the Western Cape, but also because, as you would have seen what I've already said, Western Cape has disproportionately high rates of police perpetrated domestic violence. And then, of course, I also wanted to hear from SAPs themselves, like the station commanders and the station and the domestic violence coordinators, on how they understand the problem. So that was how I set about doing it. And of course, I have to tell you my approach. So I did both quantitative and qualitative research. So the quantitative, what this involved is I looked at annual report of the Investigative Police Independent Directorate between 2012 to 2024 on death. I looked at the Civilian Secretariat of Police Services biannual DVA monitoring reports, as well as the SAPS report. So every 6 months, they have to monitor domestic violence, how the monitor domestic violence, including police perpetrated domestic violence, and then they report to Parliament. And as far as I'm aware, sorry, is someone talking? No, can I go on? Okay. So as far as I'm aware, this is the first consolidated national data set of its kind for South Africa. So I'm particularly pleased about this, that I was able to do this, but it also shows us that there's a really significant gap in oversight and in telling the story of police perpetrated domestic violence. My qualitative research component include interviews with station commanders and DV coordinators from 5 police stations. I'm just going to explain briefly how I came to these 5 police stations. So when I was doing research, my proposal for this research, I was looking through the Parliamentary Monitoring Group website, which is, records meetings held in Parliament. And in one report, I found actually the names of police stations where where cases had been opened of domestic violence perpetrated by police. I then at some conference ran into the head of domestic violence at the Provincial Western Cape office, who very kindly sent me a list of the names of stations where the police actually worked at. So there was two different sorts of lists. So then I compared these two and I tried to find which were the top 10 stations where both there were many cases reported and there were many number of perpetrators actually working at that station. And from then I selected 5 because I only had 1 year to really complete this, and I also wanted a good mix of different contexts. So I looked at rural stations like little community towns. I looked at peri-urban sort of agricultural towns, and then urban, as in Cape Town, a few stations here too. Of those people, like I said, I interviewed station commanders and DV coordinators because these are the 2 key personnel stations that are responsible for monitoring and responding to police perpetrated domestic violence. So out of all these 10 people I interviewed, there was 27 years of collective service experience between them. So these are people that have been in the police service for many, many years. And I think what I also want to really highlight, which is something that I didn't expect, and maybe naively so, out of the 10 people, there were two interviewees who had their own experience of domestic violence within their relationships. Both their partners were also police officers, so it really gave me, it added an important and really unexpected lived reality dimension to the research. Okay, so let's look at what's happening kind of globally. So this issue was first sort of reported on in the United States as early as 1980. Interestingly, this first study, it came about by surprise, actually. The research at the time was investigating stress that the partners of police officers were experiencing because their partners were police officers. But as she was conducting these interviews with the wives of police officers, she was hearing often, time and time again, that women were experiencing violence in the home. And that's when she actually decided she was going to do a proper study on it. So her first study at the time in the 1980s showed that of the, I think it was 700, I can't remember exactly, 700 and something police officers she interviewed, 40% admitted to being abusive at home. So that's almost a little bit less than half of the people were admitted to being violent. Since then, there have been various studies. The latest I could find was in 2018, and as you can see again, at least between half of police officers either knew a colleague who was involved in domestic violence or actually had responded to one. So this issue doesn't only exist in the United States. More recently in the UK in 2020 and in Australia in 2022, there was two hearings on this issue, and what these countries and these hearings revealed is that there were very similar institutional challenges. Victims were often not believed. Complaints by victims were often minimized. Investigations were mishandled. Records were poorly managed, and very few cases actually resulted in criminal convictions. So I want us to look at this globally to show that even though the context is slightly different to South Africa, what is clear is that police organizations across the world have difficulties investigating and disciplining their own members objectively, particularly where police culture, police loyalty, and solidarity become barriers to accountability rather than mechanisms that are supposed to uphold it. All right, so now let's look at how South Africa responds to domestic violence, but more specifically, police-perpetrated domestic violence. So we've been at it actually for quite a significant amount of time. In 1995, the South African Police Service Act established the first oversight body, which was known as the Independent Complaints Directorate, to investigate police misconduct and criminal offences. We were coming out of apartheid, and the police obviously wanted to change the perception and to improve the way they policed issues. And they had to hold their own police officers accountable from very much a human rights based perspective as well. So ICD was established to monitor when police do wrong, right? In 2001, the ICD then starts looking at police's compliance with the Domestic Violence Act, which came into place in 1998. Now, it wasn't too long after they started monitoring that they started seeing that there were a lot of cases of femicide where police were killing their partners. And between 2004 and 2007, there was 47 cases alone. So in 2009, they then decided to look at these cases and investigate specifically the key factors that femicide, why police were killing their partners. And there were many factors, but two of the key issues that stand out is one, that victims were trying to end abusive relationships, and the shelters and the GBV practitioners in this room know all too well that this is usually when violence escalates, when people are killed, is when they're trying to end abusive relationships. And of course, you cannot ignore that police have very easy access to firearms. Okay, so be that as it may. So the ICD found all of this out, but in general, they had very little power to really hold police accountable. So then the structure changed 3 years later. The Independent Complaints Directorate was replaced by IPID, which is the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, which reports on domestic violence related deaths, amongst many other kinds of misconduct. And then the Civilian Secretariat monitors police's compliance not only with the Domestic Violence Act, but also monitors cases of police-perpetrated domestic violence, whether the police officer is the perpetrator or whether the police officer is the victim in this case. So alongside this framework, so we've got two bodies looking at domestic violence, but from different perspectives. IPID looks at femicide, Civilian Secretariat looks at the domestic violence cases themselves before anything of extreme happens. And then we have another policy framework, which is the actual legal framework, right? What the laws actually say govern domestic violence. So the amended Domestic Violence Act that many of us also gave input on in 2021 is now far more explicit in terms of what happens when police are perpetrators. The national instructions were also updated to correspond with the DVA Amendment Act. And then we've also got the Firearms Control Act, which governs how these cases should also be managed. So, as you can see, the central issue is not the absence of legislation or policy. I mean, we've got significant framework here. A lot of attention has been given to it, but we keep returning to the same thinking and idea. Does this actually work in practice? And if not, where does it begin to fail? And what else do we need to do? So now let's get into the actual statistics of what I was able to find. So, as I said, I looked into the Independent Police Investigative Directorate annual report to actually document these cases, right? Every year they provide this information. So I collated 12 years worth of this data to show you what is the picture of deaths caused by police. So the IPID refers to these kinds of deaths as interpersonal disputes in which police are active participants in either killing their spouse or a family member. And you will see I collated all these figures and added them up, and we see that over this period of 12 years, 331 domestic violence death incidents happened. So IPID doesn't talk about people who died, they talk about an incident that happened where deaths occurred. So if you've seen some of the media articles on this, often a police officer would kill their partner, but they might also kill a family member that was in the room, or even someone who was visiting the house at the time. So this happens often. So the number of 331 is an underestimation of people that are actually dying. What the majority of deaths was caused due to shootings, in 88% of cases. The other forms of death in 35 cases was due to assault. And then there were single instances of suffocation, torture, and also in one instance there was death by someone being run over by a police car. Now, of the 331 incidences, 47 suicides followed these homicides. So in other words, police killed themselves after having killed other people. Now, I've already talked about that shooting was the most common form of murder. And in 88% of cases. 78% of these guns were actually state-issued guns. So the guns that police use when they're doing their duties from day to day. Now you will see that there is a little bit, I don't want to call it positive, but it is a positive trend in that there is a decrease from over the last 12 years, right? But I'm saying it's positive, but it's a fragile trend because you can see the numbers go up and down, right, across the years. We also know that domestic violence is often very underreported, and you're going to hear some of the other problems that I will talk about. So I'm going to say also that we should treat these cases with cautious optimism, but not complacency, because I mean, just this 2 months ago, or just this last month, there's been several cases that I've read in the media about officers killing other people and also themselves. So I suspect maybe that this figure has increased since then. Right, and now go on to offenders. What the Civilian Secretariat of Police Service reports gave me. And I must just tell you how challenging it was to find this information. So as I mentioned before, Civilian Secretariat and SAPS provide biannual reports to Parliament. So these should be publicly available documents, but I couldn't find all the documents. And there were instances where I had to ask Civilian Secretariat for documents, which they were very kind to send to me. I also asked the same of of SAPS, even though I had to apply to them to do this research. I didn't get this information from them. But either way, I did of the reports I got. It was also a bit difficult to try and make sense of the numbers because they didn't always report on it the same way in every instance. Sometimes they would have really detailed information as to how many charges there were, how many cases were withdrawn, whether there were protection orders, etc., but not always. So from 2019, though, they did start reporting on it better, which was really good to see. So it allowed me then from 2020 to 2024, so over a period of 4 years, to try and consolidate this data, to look at what these reports are telling me. I must just say that there was one discrepancy that I found, that in one particular report, the police had said that they reported on 147 officers as having committed domestic violence, but the Civilian Secretariat reported 239 cases, which is vastly different, almost double. It's concerning because these two institutions are meant to talk to each other, right? And they're meant to meet regularly and discuss these issues. It's also concerning that both of these institutions reported to Parliament. In the same meeting, they were sharing PowerPoint slides of the same data, but showing a discrepancy, and no member of Parliament actually pointed out that there was a discrepancy and there's something wrong. Anyway, so I've given you a long blah blah. But anyway, let's look at the numbers now. So what I saw over these 4 years is that 1,422 officers were reported for domestic violence nationally. So these aren't cases, but offenders, right? And you'll hear later that there are repeat offenders. So these number of domestic violence cases is actually higher. The three things that stand out here, which I've already mentioned, before, was obviously Western Cape contributes the highest number of domestic violence cases nationally. But there was also a surprising issue for me in the Free State, came up as one of the top three. And the only reason they came up in the top three is that in 2023, there was a significant increase in cases. You can't see it here because this is just the collated graph. But year on year, in 2023, there were 133 offenders compared to 40 the previous year. So there was a gigantic jump. And I'm not sure why the jump happened. I don't know if there was more reporting. or there's literally an increase in domestic violence. The rest of the provinces contribute between 1 to 3% of the to the overall figures. And yeah, again, because there's so little information, I don't know if this is the reality. Are they just, is domestic violence not happening here? It is unlikely. It's likely that it is happening. It's also very likely, we know very well that often people don't report domestic violence cases, which is even more difficult when it's a police officer. And also in some communities, as we know in the sector, some people tend to dismiss domestic violence and see it as something normal and part of life. Either way, back to the Western Cape, with this significant number of cases, I do want to add that there was some improvement. So the previous year, in 2023, there was 202 cases specifically. And then the following year, it dropped down to 150, so about 50 less offenders. Again, it's not entirely clear, the shift, but what was really encouraging was that the station commanders and domestic violence coordinators that I interviewed said that the amendment to the Domestic Violence Act actually did make a change. So hopefully things are improving there. But now I've already spoken a lot about the numbers, but now let's delve into the interviews and why the police thought this happened. So I call it the socio-cultural norm of domestic violence. So when I asked participants why it happened, one of the key messages that kept coming, that they kept repeating, was that domestic violence by police is not separate from the communities and what's happening in communities where the police officers work in and also where they come from, right? So a lot of them spoke about the impact of intergenerational cycles of violence and trauma. We know a lot that apartheid played a big role in creating communities of, if I can say, dysfunction and trauma and violence. There were also, participants also spoke about poverty, unemployment, substance abuse, etc., as being issues affecting communities, but also very much that domestic violence was a significant issue. So in 4 of the 5 stations, the SAPS officers interviewed said that domestic violence was one of the most common forms of violence that they had to attend to. So at one rural station, they would say about 90%, 90, that's a significant amount of distress calls received was about domestic violence. And in one urban township, so a station here in Cape Town, the station commander told me that he dedicated 4 to 5 police officers alone to deliver the 200 protection orders a month that they receive to be delivered onto perpetrators. That's really a significant amount. I think what I also want to highlight is that in one of the stations where it wasn't an issue, it was also quite a small rural town, but in a different context entirely. They also had fewer cases of police-perpetrated domestic violence, and none of those involved physical violence. So you can see context and circumstance and the environment does make a difference, right? So understanding context, though, doesn't excuse violence. Rather, it gives us a better insight into what's happening. So we can't look at police-perpetrated domestic violence as just a few bad apples. Many officers come into the police force already carrying violence and trauma long before they actually put on the uniform. And these experiences have to be understood in this context, that it is shaped not only by individual behavior, but these social conditions. And then we're going to look at what the other condition is, which is the actual policing, the perils, I call it the perils of policing. So we're going to look at some of the issues affecting the police. So beyond community context, participants described something else that shapes police-perpetrated domestic violence being the reality of policing themselves. Around 80% of them spoke about how difficult it was to police, how often they were exposed to murders, violent crime, fatal accidents, and domestic violence. Add to that long staff shortages, and a lot of pressure. And many described a reality where their job simply doesn't end when they leave the station. They take the stress and trauma with them home. The most, coping mechanism that police used was alcohol. So one station commander, a domestic violence coordinator actually described alcohol as flowing freely, very, very freely. And a lot of the literature internationally also shows that alcohol is often a very big component to how police handle stress. And there's a quote I want to pull out from my interview, which I think sets this context in quite well. So it says, the person said, "You drink to relax. You've done 4 shifts. It's stressful, especially on weekends and month end, where it's demarcated or rather chaotic. And so you go through these 4 shifts. Your colleague has dropped you. He's booked off sick. There's only one man handling all the stuff on a Saturday night on a month end. Now you go on rest days, you want to relax, and you've got alcohol at your disposal. 1 or 2 beers, say, for example, but then you also become another person, and then you really don't care. Use the law. I'm a police officer, so no one can tell me. I can do what I want." And often the literature does show that police often see themselves as beyond the law. Now, alongside these 2 factors is hypermasculinity, right? So, sorry. So participants described police culture as one in which they had to be very tough and very resilient and emotionally controlled at all times. So being vulnerable or showing vulnerability was seen as a weakness, leaving many officers to suppress rather than process the trauma they experienced. And I want to be clear about the argument I'm making here. Occupational stress does not cause domestic violence, nor does trauma, nor does alcohol. But again, once you mix all these factors together, right? And in the context of existing personal vulnerabilities, when you add relationship conflict to it, financial pressures, you just get a situation that increases the risk of violence. So what many participants also had an issue though is that there was institutional deficiencies. In other words, that the police system and the institution itself will place more value on output. So they prioritize operational demands over the wellness of police officers. So, and I'm going to tell you more about that a bit shortly. But now, if you I think, okay, this is very complex, but I think you have to understand how this works. So before we look at the challenges of addressing police-perpetrated domestic violence, I actually want to show you what it's meant to do in practice, right? It's very useful for those of you in sheltering sector, for example, to know, like, what is it supposed to look like in practice? So, what is the time anyway? Sorry, let me check if I'm on time. Okay. So when a complaint is first reported to either at a police station or at the scene, the officers attending to the case must complete a domestic violence form, right? So there's one that is called the 508C form if the officer is an offender, and a 508D form if the member is a victim. And they must both be filed in the occurrence book. Those of you in the sector know what this is. And then the forms must be submitted to the station commander or the commander of the member where this either caused the domestic violence or was a victim to it. The commander then sends these forms to the provincial heads of visible policing, of discipline management, and health and wellness. The DV coordinator themselves manages this administrative paperwork and the required referrals. From there, two processes follow, right? So if there's charges laid, then there's a criminal process that follows. So the person is, once an investigation is done, the person or gets arrested at the scene of the crime, depending on the case. Their firearm is seized and a Section 102 inquiry is opened, which is when they determine whether you fit to use a gun. Now, the Firearms Control Act is very clear on what these conditions are. So you are deemed not worthy, it's not the right word, but you're deemed not capable of using a gun if there's a final protection order against you, if there are threats or express intent to kill or injure themselves or others, or if a state of mind, condition, or substance dependence makes possessing a weapon a risk to anyone. Now, once charged, the officer is suspended pending a bail hearing. Once bail is granted, they are reinstated into the police service. But they're not supposed to engage, they're not supposed to be out in the field. They're supposed to be restricted to administrative duties. Their names are also added to a register that's held in the police safe to show that their name is put there and they can't be given a gun when they are working. Now, alongside the criminal process, if there is one, there should always be a disciplinary process. So it should trigger an internal disciplinary investigation. And how this happens is that a investigating officer from the same police station that you work at investigates your case of domestic violence. The station commander chooses who the detective is that's going to investigate the case. Once this person has interviewed the perpetrator, they then give their recommendation through to the provincial office, and the Western Cape in this instance will then select a presiding officer to listen to the case. And then the officer is allowed to have a legal representative or a union representative present, depending on the level of the issue. And finally, both of these processes should lead to a referral to employee health and wellness. But however, you will hear going for counseling is not mandatory, it's voluntary. And officers may decline to use employee health and wellness. They can also go with PolMed, which is their medical aid. But it's not a requirement unless the discipline action says you must go. All right, moving on from there, let's look at what happens after. So this was very kind of somewhat easy to see in the national instructions and the acts, and then some of this I got from actually speaking to the police officers, because it's not clear. This on paper, it doesn't talk about disciplinary hearings, who presides over them, etc. So this was, having these interviews helped. So now I've talked about how the system is supposed to work, but then we also hear where things did go wrong, right? So first and foremost, a lot of people said the issue is that cases aren't being reported. Victims are reluctant to report. There's financial dependence. They fear retaliation. There's often pressure also from family members to not lay a charge or even to withdraw a case once it's already in the system. We know that has since changed. You can't really withdraw, but this was standard process. Some participants also described the use of counter charges. So a police officer accused of domestic violence will then lay a counter charge against the victim, which often leads to the situation where the victim will withdraw the case. repeat offending was also an issue. So at one station, it was a small rural town, so it kind of had that many officers, but at this station alone, there were 10 officers who were linked to 18 domestic violence complaints, with just 4 of those officers contributing to 12 cases. So that's rather significant. So what this points to is that there are repeated warning signs. So you've got multiple cases, but yet things are still going on. And often these are warning signs, long before they actually lead to to significant violence. The second barrier was investigations and the actual oversight. Now, as I mentioned before, when you're doing, aside from the criminal charge, now we're looking only at disciplining the police officers. It's the same colleague who's at the station with you investigates your case, which can lead some kind of, there is the potential for bias. But then there was also, a lot of people said there was an over-reliance on the accused officer's version of events. And then sometimes there was also victim blaming or dismissing of cases. So the one police officer told me of a case where, he said like, he was saying, oh, you beat up your wife because she had an affair. Oh, that's okay, don't, it's okay. That's kind of common in relationships. We can dismiss that. It's not as serious. So there's this undermining of domestic violence and undermining and dismissing of cases. There were also some allegations of cover-up. So some officers were trying to convince victims to withdraw cases or not to lay charges so they could protect their fellow officer. And others talked about investigations were often delayed. So things were done on purpose. I spoke about how quickly this action should be taken once a case is made, but often there was delays, weeks and months, especially when an officer was up for promotion, for example. So they would delay and delay and delay, and hope that eventually the victim would withdraw the case, or that he's just it just kind of falls flat in the process. Yeah. So, and then the final, yeah, okay. I've just included some quotes here that you can also read on your own. So lastly, the discipline and accountability part. I already talked about, how doing the investigations can be tricky. Disciplinary hearings can also be tricky because you are putting a police officer, usually a station commander, presiding over a hearing, but it doesn't mean necessarily that these people are trained to disciplinary hearings. They are station commanders. So they're not made for this kind of disciplining. I personally think, and a lot of the interviewers said the same thing. And yeah, I'm running out of time, so I actually won't go into a lot of details, but you can see when it comes to, if you want to read my dissertation, I've got lots of information there, that there's very little accountability. In one particular year, for example, there were 178 cases, and only one person was actually suspended. A lot of the cases, were withdrawn or found not guilty, etc. So besides these cases being overheard by people that are not necessarily trained in human resources, there were also complaints that unions and legal representatives tried to find loopholes to kind of withdraw cases or to find ways of getting it out of the system. There were also examples of when, those listening to doing the hearings had some kind of favoritism towards the police officer, etc. So there were foundational issues, right? And then what I haven't also talked about is the regulations themselves. So SAPS has a 2016 disciplinary regulation framework, but it refers to misconduct and responding to misconduct as corrective. In other words, let's fix it rather than punitive. So we don't want to punish people, we want to fix it. That's how the disciplinary kind of framework is that's how it talks about misconduct and trying to address cops that are guilty of crimes. Now, there's also an issue with how domestic violence actually doesn't even feature as a standalone issue. And I think a lot of us already know this because domestic violence isn't a category of crime on its own. So this kind of plays out in the disciplinary regulations again. But in terms of discipline, there are two kinds of cases. So police, there are less serious cases, and then there are what they call serious misconduct cases. So less serious cases don't need a hearing. They result in corrective counseling or a warning. Now, I don't know about corrective counseling in cases of domestic violence, but there were many reports that I read where officers accused of domestic violence were given corrective counseling, how you, correct yourself in this instance. But serious misconduct involves things like theft, assault, rape, murder, as well as bringing SAPS into disrepute. That is when a whole, hearing should take place. And there's also an instance where they talk about, in some cases, they'll do an expeditious process, which means that you actually forego a whole hearing and it's only must be attended by a brigadier or someone higher of status. You don't need legal representation or union representation, and you can actually be dismissed immediately. But it's not the paper, there's no way that you can see, there's no clear distinction in the disciplinary regulations when an expedition process should kick in. And there was one particular station commander that gave me an example of a domestic violence case that absolutely he said he would have fired the person on the spot, but that for some reason this person was not fired and just kept going. So now, basically, so clearly now, you can see that having policies and procedures in place does not guarantee accountability. And the effectiveness of the system ultimately depends on the willingness and the capacity of individuals to firstly report those cases, but also then once it's in the system to investigate these cases properly and to apply disciplinary measures consistently and without fear or favor. Okay, I will never shut up. I've got so much to say. All right, let's talk about firearms management. Okay, this is an issue obviously that is of grave concern and is what often, as you've heard, leads to death, right? So now all of the people interviewed said removing a gun is an important step in the process. Even though the national instructions, for example, says it doesn't always have to be removed, that sometimes there are conditions. I also spoke about it in the Firearms Control Act. Guns are seized when there's a threat to life. But these officers, these station commanders I interviewed said it's rather let's remove the gun. Let's rather be preventative than take a chance. But the thing is also, when you're removing guns from domestic violence abusers, it creates a problem for the station commander themselves in terms of operations, right? So here's a quote I put in here about the station commander saying, if 3 members on duty are accused of domestic violence, then there's one less vehicle on the road, which affects service delivery, right? And if you think about the rural town that I spoke about where you've got 10 officers accused of domestic violence, you're removing all of those guns and you're removing them from operational duties, and now they're sitting, in an administrative role. You can see it makes a big problem for the station commander themselves. But obviously, you've got trying to provide a service, but you're also putting victims at risk. Now, one of the persons, and if you remember earlier, I said that one of the people I interviewed was a domestic violence victim. by the police officer partner of theirs. And they told me that even though they had taken out a protection order against their partner at the station that they were both based at, this their perpetrator was often given a gun and told to go out in the field because they were really short-staffed. So, having the protection order, removing the gun did not happen. Yeah, and then there's also I'll speak about this also a bit later, but the fact that guns are only removed for a period of 5 years is a problem. As you can see in Richard Smith, I mean, it didn't take long after he got his gun back. Hello? Mr. Pillable, sorry, okay, I'm almost done. I've lost my train of thought. Okay. Then finally, I think something I didn't expect was to hear about the consequences police get paid more for danger pay, they call it. So when you're out in the field, your salary is higher than if you are in an administrative office. So, having your gun removed costs you financially. But for many people, it also had a psychological impact on their sense of self. And one of the people I interviewed who was both a victim and a perpetrator of domestic violence, said that when their gun was removed, they said it was the same like they came to work wearing socks without shoes. So removing a gun takes away your identity as a police officer. Now, it's also been shown the literature. I didn't read this, but I mean, in the literature that I looked at, there was a connection between removing a gun and suicide. Um, so I'm not diminishing the importance of removing guns to protect victims. But what it does reinforce for me is that when you do remove a gun, police wellness must go hand in hand. Yeah, which is my next point, employee wellness, which I think is a very much a neglected front line when it comes to police. So police has, as you've heard, does have employee health and wellness program. However, at the time when I was doing the research, I had found a figure that there were only 621 employees employed in this employee health and wellness, catering for 187,000 police officers. So that's a very minimal number, obviously. Some stations do have people on site. They often what they call police chaplains who offer some kind of counseling. But the people I interviewed, including a victim of police-perpetrated domestic violence, said that it wasn't very helpful, and that they didn't feel supported. So just give me a second. Yeah. Let me just, oh, sorry, almost done. Okay. So a lot of the police also complain that there's no mandatory debriefing after traumatic incidences, including domestic violence related deaths. So there was one officer whose colleague had killed his partner and then in the police barracks had taken a gun and shot himself. So this officer that I was interviewing had to climb into the window of the police barracks and he found his colleague's body. But he said at no point was there any kind of counseling given to him. They just expected that he would just get on with the job. So already he's quite traumatized about the kinds of work he's doing, but he's also now witnessing. He's lost a colleague who's killed themselves. He's shocked that his colleague had killed his girlfriend. So there's a whole lot of trauma and things going on that is problematic. And then, of course, there's what I've already talked about, the hypermasculinity, this idea that you have to be tough and that you have to have to handle your own trauma on your own and drink it away, essentially. But there's also a certain amount of stigma and judgment. A lot of people also said how there's a lot of gossip in police stations. If one person knows your story, everybody knows the story. Um, and in a lot of instances, domestic violence was also made fun of, so for the victim or the perpetrator. And yeah, so, and this is kind of what I found overall. And that's actually, it was at this point that I got the title for my dissertation, which was, Kapu was describing how all of this trauma and everything else compounds it, and then unaddressed trauma spills over into the home. So he said, and then you go home having anger issues, and then maybe you don't know how to control it, and then the next person that will be your punching bag will be your partner. So this is a sentence that I carried with me, captures the tragedy, I think, of the situation, of the research, that violence experienced in the workplace should never become violence that is inflicted at home. Police-perpetrated domestic violence therefore requires more than discipline action, right? It also requires understanding and recognizing risk earlier, supporting officers more effectively, and creating a culture, I think, where a police culture where seeking help shouldn't be seen as a sign of weakness, but rather as a sign of professionalism. And I'm almost done. All right. There are four areas I think that require some change for things to be better addressed and hopefully prevented. Obviously, I've already spoken about oversight. I think there is some serious problems in how, even though we've got all these reports, the Civilian Secretariat time and time again makes recommendations for how to change things. SAPS doesn't necessarily listen, or at least the institution doesn't. There's discrepancies between how these two, Civilian Secretariat and SAPS, communicate. They're obviously, like I told you, that in the instance in Parliament, where they were reporting on different figures, but no one mentioned it. So, which means also Parliament needs to have stronger oversight or a different form of oversight. Then I think there's also the issue, obviously, of accountability. The processes for responding to domestic violence by police on paper, I think, is in place. It's very clear there are processes and procedures in place. But as you can see, outcomes are inconsistent, depends on the commitment of individual officers rather than the strength of the system itself. So based on this, I think that relying on the police to police domestic violence by police is not enough. So I would recommend dedicated, specially trained teams to investigate police-perpetrated domestic violence and oversee the disciplinary processes, rather than relying on the station or the provincial body. I also think that the 2016 SAPS disciplinary regulations needs to be aligned to the 2021 Domestic Violence Act amendment, because clearly these two are not talking to each other. Thirdly, firearms. Yeah, that's obviously we need to look at that very seriously. Capacity issues shouldn't be a reason for not removing guns from abusive people. And that 5-year period of disqualification also needs to be really looked at. I know that the firearms control bill, has been stalled in Parliament for some time. Last year, there was some more movement on that front, and hopefully, and I know Gun Free South Africa is in the room with us today, has said that this 5-year limit must be withdrawn entirely. And then finally, wellness. I think they need psychosocial support beyond POLMED, beyond employee health and wellness. I think it needs to be a separate entity entirely, so that counseling is seen as safe and confidential. Often also people didn't want to go for counseling because they're afraid it gets held against them in their records that they are problematic and it might interfere with their job. I also think they need better gender sensitivity training and address a police culture that that normalizes domestic violence, and that also makes fun of those that are seeking help for it. And I think finally, commanders should be equipped to recognize and respond to early warning signs. So, are you seeing escalating aggression, like in the case of Richard? Are you seeing, increasing use of alcohol misuse? Are police being more often absent than not? I think if you have all these warning signs, hopefully you'd be better prepared. And finally, my last slide, and I'm sure you're tired of hearing my voice by now. I have this quote. It's not, well, it's what I wrote in the dissertation. In my conclusion is that trying to understand is that I see police are a product of their environment, but it mustn't excuse this behavior, right? So I've had this, I've tried to hold both parts of that sentence in balance throughout my dissertation and throughout the presentation. I mean, specifically because I don't want to excuse the behavior, but you must, I think it was very easy, not easy, but like easier to understand why it can end up being. Was I kicked out?
Claudia, sorry, I'm just checking with you. I got disconnected for a second. Are we
Okay.
still?
Okay. Oh gosh. When last did you hear me?
Okay, so your presentation, you're not sharing anymore, right? So
No, I'm
um,
not sure anymore. Anyway, that was me concluding it basically. So I think, the police is under immense stress, and problems like that. But I think also police is in crisis, and I think we need to dedicate really a lot of time, not only to accountability, but also police wellness, because we're not going to, reduce domestic violence. We're not going to help these victims also if we're not trying to change how things are for perpetrators. So that is it for me. I now really, I think we have a little bit of time for some questions and answers, which I'm happy to answer. And then if anyone wants to say anything, but I'm going to hand it now back to you, Anissa.
thank you so much, Claudia, for a very, very interesting presentation. I think the findings were a real eye-opener. I think it talks to the realities there, and it really brings up issues around both not just our law enforcement, but also, we've been working closely with Gun Free South Africa, and I see Stanley's here, Claire's here also, and some stats also spoke to the use of firearms in domestic violence cases, and it comes up so clearly here in this presentation as well. So I don't see any questions in the chat, except lots of people are requesting, oh, there is one question, right? So before that, Claudia, lots of people are requesting the presentation, and we usually do share the presentation with participants, but also there was an earlier request from someone for your dissertation. I don't know if you want to flight your slide with your email address, or you want to post your email address in the chat for
Yeah.
those of you who would like the full dissertation. And then I'm going to go to the one question I see, and that is, has this research been formally presented to SAPS? And that question comes from Ms. Caroline Peters.
Caroline, my good friend. No, it has not. I've shared it with once I completed the research, I shared it obviously as I'm mandated to with the research unit. I've never heard back from them, and I think it must definitely be shared with them. I've been enjoying my life after the dissertation and living, having fun times on weekends and after hours, and just trying to focus on work and life. But I think, honestly, Anissa and Zubaida, if you hadn't invited me to do this, it's been on my, I need to do something more because this is important, groundbreaking stuff, and I don't even have a journal article out yet. So this has really given me a bit of a real push saying, it's time to get this information out there because there's no point doing this research and it sits in some library that doesn't get read by people. It's important stuff and I think it can be changed. So definitely, yeah, there's a public hearings on being hosted by the CGE and the South African Human Rights Commission and FHR coming up. I think I'm gonna present some of the stuff. I'm gonna do a submission, present it to them. It's on GBV and the criminal justice system. And then yeah, I must find ways of sharing this information and finding space to talk to SAPS and IPID and Civilian Secretariat about all of this. Yeah.
Great job on the presentation, but also on the research itself, Claudia. And I know you say there's always lots to do still, and I hear you about wanting to create a space for yourself also. But so I see, and I noticed in some of the chat, some of the comments there, there's also a lot of emotion around the presentation, and that emotion mostly revolves around anger. But also, there's a suggestion from Joan. Joan is saying perhaps to ask if we can present at the Justice Cluster in Parliament.
Yeah.
Um,
Good
and
idea.
then also Natasha. Yes, we need some kind of campaign to amplify this research. And I'm so happy to see so many familiar names and stakeholders and connections and partners. It's really wonderful. And thank you again, Claudia, for getting us together. I think it's been beneficial both ways. So now we're spurring you some around getting moving on it. But yeah, when you're ready, keep us posted about what's happening and which spaces you're presenting at, because we'll certainly be there to cheer you on.
Thank
And then there's Kailash is asking, could we ask a question? So yes, Kailash, you can. Please do go ahead. You can unmute and ask.
Thanks, Nisa, and hi everyone. Claudia, exceptional research. It's really so exciting. Congratulations on it. And yeah, I'm your one of your biggest supporters for you to publish and get it out there. But just in terms of a comment, and it might have come up in your presentation, but I've just done research now with AIDS funds. It was an evaluation where we looked at um, policing and sex workers, and very much similar dynamics to issues around domestic violence. Social norms and so on.
Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
You just faded. Do you have a question?
Oh no, I'm sorry, I don't know, but just the one comment that a police um informant made was the issue around trauma informed policing, which I think
Mm,
is something that you have picked up on and certainly seem to be recommending. So, not just trauma informed policing from the perspective of clients, but how do you actually incorporate trauma informed training and awareness and well being for police who have to really see the ugly side of life all the time?
100%, yeah. 100%. I think it's really, really, I think, neglected. And when I was doing this research, I've been in the domestic violence sector for many, many years, and often I'm very angry at the police for failing to help victims, etc., etc. But honestly, I finished the dissertation feeling an immense amount of empathy And it feels bad when you're dealing domestic violence and your heart goes with the victim. But then you're also hearing this side of the equation where it's, these are damaged people who are not getting support, who are not finding the ways of coping with their trauma and stress, and they are drinking to deal with stress, and then they take the violence out at home. So I had a lot of empathy for the cops, to be honest. And even in the interviews I had, sometimes it felt like I was counseling them because they were themselves not the perpetrators, but themselves were. It was very clear. Policing is hard. Yeah. So I have a lot of more empathy than I thought I would have, to be honest. Thanks, Kailash. I see, Anissa, I don't know, but I see a bunch of other questions. If maybe I can just answer.
Yes, there are quite a few. I
Yeah.
see participants are engaging quite a bit. So there's one question from Fatima Otaleb. Thank you, Fatima, for joining. Fatima's from our ANWS group. Are there any figures of the victims' race and origin? So I think the focus was more on the
Not at
the
all. Yeah. Not because I don't see it as relevant, but because I don't see it in the reports that the Civilian Secretariat doesn't report on it. I did ask when I did this research, when I did the application to do this research, I actually asked to see the case files, which was my ideal, trying to understand what happened, but I wasn't granted this by the police because you have to ask police to for permission to do research, and they wouldn't grant me the case files, which I can understand. But I would like to do a PhD on this, so maybe I could get this information. And as much as race and origin, there was also a question about numbers of female and male perpetrators. It didn't come across. It came across. It was very rare. So I asked this question in interviews, and in all the cases that I had been seeing, there was only about 3 females that were perpetrators. So it didn't come across. It very much came across as men being the primary abusers and women being the victims. But it does also show you the dimensions when you're thinking about policing and the police culture and this, that they're trained to use weapons, that they're supposed to be kind of, assertive and aggressive, that it does influence. There is research that shows that it does influence. It does influence some of perpetration by females, but it didn't come out. It wasn't a big thing. It wasn't a big issue. And not, yeah, nowhere in the Civilian Secretariat is it really spoken about. Yeah, so I couldn't answer that either. Maybe a PhD is another thing that will bring it on. Should I just, Anissa, should I just answer more questions? There's 2 more minutes left, so I don't know if I can answer all of that, but yeah,
Thanks,
yeah.
Claudia. Sorry, Anissa's just had to run out quickly to another meeting, so
Okay.
I'm going to be taking over facilitating for you. So Celeste Lowe had a hand up, but I see she has put something in the chat as well. She wants to congratulate you on your hard work. I want to add that from my analysis of our helpline data, I can agree that the cases are underreported to policing. Sorry, we get many of them, and they refuse to report. We helped find others ways to assist and help them find healing.
Oh, that'd be so amazing to get access to some of that data if you don't mind sharing it.
If I may, I'd like. Thank you for that. I think you've done some great work, and I'd really like to chat further. So I have dropped my email, and I think Melanie and Anissa have got my contact details. I'd love to get together and have a chat and see how we can work together.
Oh, awesome, thank you.
Thanks for that, Celeste. Yes, that would be great. Claudia, I can share that with you. And then with
Awesome.
regards to your dissertation, I wanted to check with you if you want to maybe share the link with me. And then also the presentation and recordings, if you don't mind. I do usually post that up on our YouTube page. So if that's fine with you, then I can share your presentation with the link for the YouTube page as well as then the link for your dissertation.
Yeah, I don't have my dissertation online, but I can email it to people, but I don't mind the actual
Okay.
presentation itself, that online would be great. Yeah, I don't
Okay,
know.
perfect. So if you
Run
want to
out of
share that with
time.
me, we can send it in as one email to everybody if that's fine with you.
Yeah, all good.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. I just want to check and see if there was other questions here. I just wanted to see how far Nisa got with it. So we did Fatima's. Did we do Peter's? So Peter Johnson said, did your
Yeah,
findings note significant? That one.
yeah.
Desna Besta, based on what you shared regarding the fears connected to counseling, what do you think could be the implications of mandating counseling? Do you think it could be potentially remove the fear that counseling could interfere with their work or complicate police culture further?
I've always I've always been a proponent of mandatory counseling. I think it stands them in good stead. I think it would take away the stigma if everyone is expected to attend counseling. So I would fully agree with that. I don't see it being harmful to police culture. I think it would improve things. Capacity wise, I don't know when they'd go for the counseling, but either way, I think it's absolutely imperative, and I would 100% say make it mandatory. I don't see why it should be voluntary because yeah, no one wants to go for counseling. If things are really tough, it can be really, really hard to go for counseling, and when you're supposed to be tough and uh, you have to have provider. It's very hard to be vulnerable and then also it's fearful, trying to be vulnerable can open up a whole can of worms. So I absolutely think mandatory counseling would be great, and certainly more attention. I mean, at the start of a shift, there's always, at the end of a shift, there's always a period where the station commander talks to the people on duty, but there's no proper debriefing. They're just like, okay, what happened tonight? Oh, there was a murder. All right. Well, anyway, I hope you have a good rest or whatever. There's no actual debriefing, which is neglectful, I think. But I can also understand they're busy. But anyway, yeah, that's the
Okay.
last.
All right. Then I just, oh, sorry, I know we're running slightly over time. Claudia, do you still have a few minutes to spare?
I do, yeah.
Well, thank you. Okay, then from Pamela, what did you find on demographic or occupational factors that are associated with police officers implicated in domestic violence cases based on available data?
Yeah, I think maybe you missed some of the presentation, but I did talk quite a bit about the operational factors within the police service that contribute to police-perpetrated domestic violence. Um, if you want my dissertation, I'll share it. I go into a lot more depth. There was also a lot of literature that I didn't actually share here, that really explains the context, about how what are the factors, that contribute to it. I mean, I think if I remember off by heart, one of the there was a link, there was a study that was done that showed that if the police officers who experienced trauma were 4 times more likely to be abusers than those that weren't, and that those who abused alcohol were 8 times more likely to be abusers, violent domestic abusers. So this is, in the US, not in South Africa. We haven't done that kind of research, but it does show you like these are precursors and risks to violence, and that issues that should be paid attention to. I hope that answers the question, but yeah, I'm happy to share the full dissertation with you.
Thanks, Claudia, for that. Then a comment from Emily, and this gives light to why many police officers are taking bribes and become corrupt. They're walking around and showing up to save others while they are empty and hurt. Thank you for the presentation, absolutely enlightening. Thank you from Kashifa, from Deborah, Fatima, Peter, Claire Taylor. So she's written a bit here. I just want to read that to you. An excellent and vitally important research project, Claudia. Congratulations on the insight it provides. I have a couple of comments on firearms. First, the issue of routinely arming police needs to be interrogated in its own right. This means asking harder questions about who should be armed based on the work they do, the training they receive, and the support available to them. Secondly, for your information, sorry, my icon's over it. Proposed amendment to the Firearms Control Act will remove the 5-year unfitness disqualification period. SAP says this fixed period is being exploited, with disqualified people claiming a right to be rearmed once 5 years have passed. Removing it gives more discretion over how long someone stays disqualified, which could mean less than 5 years in some cases, not more. Then, yeah, so I'm not too sure if you want to comment on that one. It's an improvement.
Yeah, no, I'm glad. I
Okay,
know
then
that we were
thanks.
pushing for that, so yeah, I'm pleased about that.
Yeah, then quite a few thank yous from everybody. Then from Dr. Stanley, the relation or strong link between firearms and GBV is well articulated. Would encourage as many stakeholders here to be on the lookout when the firearms control amendment submissions are out for public comments to come out full force and make inputs on limits and accountability issues when it comes to firearms in South Africa. Very true, Dr. Stanley. And then from Deborah Rowe, are there any patterns in the history's upbringing of the perpetrators?
I didn't speak to the perpetrators themselves, but when I interviewed domestic violence coordinators and looking at other research that has been done on police, it was clear that a lot of them come into the police service with a lot of, trauma and abuse from growing up. Like I said, the police are, work in communities that they were raised in also often, communities that are, with intergenerational cycles of violence, substance abuse, poverty. So there was a lot of trauma that people came in. So there were station commanders and domestic violence coordinators who told me about particular cases of, cops that were coming to work living in shacks, and having no support systems, and really coming into difficult situations and having their own histories of being abused as children. And some of the international literature, especially from the US, talks about that kind of thing, the patterns of upbringing. I didn't have the ability to delve into that. I would have liked that. I would have liked to get an understanding of that. Yeah, thank you.
So for your next dissertation.
Awesome.
On that note, though, not to take up too much more of your time, on behalf of the NSM, we'd like to thank you, Claudia, for this very insightful session you've given us today. It's really saddening, and like you said, it's upsetting to see what's going on, and hopefully that if you do get the time that you can hand it over to Parliament and see what you can do. Because something definitely does need to be done.
Yeah.
But we thank you so much, and we thank everybody for taking the time out to join us today, and we wish everybody a blessed day going forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.